He wanted a silent, obedient wife, but she uncovered a truth powerful enough to shake his entire empire. And when she finally spoke, the whole world listened. Before we begin, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more shocking and emotional stories. Adana's wedding day shone like a storybook promise, the chapel draped in white and gold, guests murmuring admiration, cameras flashing as if trying to capture a future everyone believed would be perfect, and she walked down that aisle with a smile that trembled only a little because beneath the lace and pearls a small part of her wondered quietly whether she was stepping into love or into a role. Tobichukwu. Tobe took her hand with a firmness that felt less tender than instructional, his fingers guiding her like a careful curator setting an exhibit in place, and when she laughed too loudly at a joke her sister made, he leaned in, his smile practiced for the cameras, and hissed, "Lower your voice, Adana. People are watching," as if she were an object to be adjusted for the public's comfort rather than a person being celebrated. She forgave the whisper as wedding nerves, as tradition, as a pressure of being seen beside a man whose name opened doors and whose suit accounted for half the stories at the reception, but the first seed of doubt planted itself in the soil of her new life. During the vows, when she paused to breathe in the moment, he tightened his grip and murmured, "Say it properly," and the warmth of the ceremony curdled into performance. After the ceremony, guests poured congratulations like honey, but every compliment toward her felt half redirected, softened into praise for the man who had chosen her, and Tobe's hand never left the small of her back without the same polite control, rearranging her posture for photos, repositioning her veil, instructing her to smile just so. The honeymoon was a parade of luxury, private islands, five-star suites, dinners on moonlit terraces, but behind every romantic setting there was a line of small commands. Don't interrupt me. Keep quiet when my colleagues speak. A wife ought to be graceful and small. He said them in a voice that was warm in public and cold in private, delivered like marital tradition rather than coercion, and she began to feel the air around her tighten as if the world expected her to fold into a quieter shape. She used to be loud with ideas, fierce with ambition, the kind of woman who argued gently with a taxi driver about a wrong turn and debated with professors about literature. Now, softened by gifts and soothed by adoration, she still felt the pulse of her old self in private moments, when she would whisper dreams into a bedside journal at 3 a.m, yet morning by morning, decision by decision, she surrendered little things. A job application not sent because it's not necessary. A speech swallowed because it's not the time. Tobe's family arrived for the second week of celebrations and brought with them a doctrine older than their generation. A woman's voice should be measured, his mother said, smiling like a woman who had practiced this line for decades, and the household hummed with small rituals of obedience disguised as respect. At a dinner where Tobe's investors discussed expansion plans in the stock market, someone asked Adana about her academic work, and she answered with the warmth and intelligence she always wore, and the table turned to admire her eloquence, except Tobe, who under the table squeezed her thigh until she flinched and later in the car accused her with a hand to her face. "Why did you embarrass me?" She apologized, confused, and that night, in the quiet of their suite while the city glittered like 100 tiny excused truths below them, she opened a notebook and wrote, simply and clearly into the white page, "If I do not speak anywhere, I will disappear." And the sentence felt less like a fear and more like a prophecy that would shape everything to come. She began to record slights and corrections, the small rewrites of her personality, because the world applauded the image, and no one will believe the erosion of a woman's agency without proof. She wrote who said what, when her laughter was hushed, the names of friends who stopped calling, the times she found herself polite to a fault to keep peace, and each line she inked felt like a brick being stacked for a future she did not yet understand she was building, a future where the truth might be the only weapon left. After the honeymoon, the house settled into a predictable rhythm, a glossy life filled with appointed weekends, charity galas, and dinners where Dana was expected to be the perfect hostess. But inside the pattern, the rules of silence tightened like a slow vice. Early mornings were for Toad's calls and late evenings for his meetings, and she learned to keep her questions brief, to smile more than she spoke, to defer to his plans, because when she didn't, she felt the sharpness of his disappointment like a physical thing, and his disappointment often arrived disguised as worry for the family's image. "We have responsibilities," he would say. "We must be careful. You do not want to make our people uncomfortable," and with each careful corrective remark she felt the bright pieces of herself dim. She had been raised by a mother who argued taxes at kitchen tables and who taught her to name injustices, who encouraged her study and her voice, so the silence was foreign and painful. She tried to reconcile her upbringing with the life she promised, telling herself that compromise was part of marriage, that small sacrifices are the price of love. Yet those small sacrifices began to add up into a day when she would not speak at all about things that mattered. He subtly forbade her from attending certain meetings, telling her it was inappropriate while he kept his world of business and politics separate and private. And when she tried to express unease about his late-night absences, he would answer, "You worry too much. Trust me." And his trust was a command, not a comfort. Friends who once laughed with her about films and dreams began to drift as dinner invites diminished and her social calendar was curated around events suited to a quiet wife. She started knitting a gentle persona for public consumption while privately scribbling questions in margins of notebooks. The first time she felt burned by deliberate humiliation, it was at a charity auction where Toad corrected her answer to an auctioneer in front of a room that expected her to be charming and unassuming. He leaned over and said, loud enough for the table to hear, "Let the men speak about money," and her cheeks burned with shame, though she had only meant to help. And later that night, when she confronted him about the sting of public shaming, he folded the moment into an anecdote about tradition and respect and the necessity for a woman not to overstep. The household became governed by small decrees. No strong opinions at social functions, no uninvited questions at work events, no laughter that lasted too long. And while at first she measured her speech with the carefulness of someone learning a new language, it soon became more than technique. It became fear. She noticed how Toad's friends treated her as an accessory to his life, complimentary about her smile but rarely curious about her thoughts, and she grew tired of the performative domesticity that required her to be attractive and silent simultaneously. Late at night she would sit with her notebook and outline the list of things she had given away in the name of harmony, a promotion passed up, conversations avoided, truth softened, until the list read like a ledger of small deaths, and with every line she wrote the idea of escape, of reclaiming voice, shaped itself into something stubborn and numinous inside her. There were moments of softness. Toad would bring flowers and apologize for a sharp word. There would have tender evenings where he seemed like the man she married, but those apologies rarely altered the pattern. They merely smoothed over the next command, and the cycles of control and contrition trained her into an instinctual quiet, a survival habit that taught her the cost of truth. Yet beneath the conditioned silence, her thoughts kept coming, bright and insistent. She began to watch him with new eyes, cataloging inconsistencies, noting the late calls he never explained, the receipts that did not align with stories, the times his temper flared when she asked about the smallest things, and with each observation she became less willing to accept the easy cover of tradition. Her notebook filled with more than feelings. It collected names, dates, the small betrayals, and a growing archive that she felt one day she might need. Though she did not yet know what she would do with it, she understood it would not be enough to simply whisper her pain into a page forever. The first public humiliation that cracked something open happened on a night that was supposed to be celebration, a business gala where Toad's firm announced a major partnership, and everyone drank champagne and tried to smile bigger than the city lights outside. And in the clamor, a colleague asked Adana about her own plans, and she, carrying the uneasy confidence that had not yet been fully stamped out by months of correction, spoke earnestly about starting a small community program for girls. In her old neighborhood, the table listened with polite applause, and someone complimented her vision. But Toad's face tightened into a polite mask, and after the cameras had stopped flashing, he caught her hand under the table and squeezed so hard she flinched. And in the car he admonished her with a tone that contained cold calculation. "You embarrass me," he said. "Why speak of such things in public? It makes me look weak." He framed his anger as a defense of reputation, and when she questioned him, asking why her voice should be a liability in the room where he conducted business, he replied, "There are things women should not handle. Let men decide the public matters," and his certainty arrived like a verdict. She went home that night stunned and furious and small all at once, feeling the brittle shame of someone who had been scolded for kindness, and for the first time her notebook filled with more than sadness. She detailed the event, wrote down names, transcribed his words as a preserving testimony for a future jury, and then she began to look for evidence of other slips, receipts, bank notices, emails, that might explain his need for control. One afternoon she found a locked drawer in his office, the kind of drawer that did not belong to a man who had nothing to hide, and when she opened it while he was away she discovered legal documents, unsigned contracts, and letters hinting at deals that smelled of corruption and leverage. She had no context for most of what she read, but the pattern tasted like betrayal. When he returned and saw a hand on the papers, he acted like a gentleman offended, mildly flustered, almost amused, and said, "Never go through my things." Curiosity in a woman is poisonous, his voice a velvet weapon. The anger in him that followed was soft and clinical. He treated her like a child who had broken a rule and deserved a lesson more than a conversation, and she became painfully aware that her curiosity threatened a private world he would guard fiercely. After that, she watched him more closely. Late-night meetings he would not describe, messages that he deleted in a hurry when his phone buzzed, and a social calendar that conveniently excluded her from the nights when he made the deals he never wanted her to know about. The more she observed, the more convinced she became that the silence he demanded was not simply about decorum but about covering cracks in an empire, and though fear flickered at the edge of her decisions, a new stubbornness rose too, the kind of quiet resolve that forms in someone who decides to keep proof of truth even when the world expects them to forget. She began copying documents, taking photos with a hidden phone, saving screenshots, and storing evidence like contraband because she knew an accusation without proof would vanish beneath his status and charm. In the privacy of her journal, she wrote not just of pain but of plans, small strategic notes about who might believe her and what could make the public listen. And in that act of preparation, she felt less like a shrinking wife and more like a woman reclaiming agency piece by piece. As the months passed, pressure turned into pattern and pattern into crisis. Togue's world grew larger and louder while his space in it grew narrower and more controlled, and the signs of a deeper deception multiplied. Strange wire transfers she noticed on a shared statement, a new set of contact who arrived like shadows at his office, and the sudden change in legal documents she found one night that excised a name from what had been promised in their marriage contracts. Little legal edits that hinted at a future where she would be erased from inheritance or influence. The betrayal cut another way when she discovered a message thread where he had lied about a business trip, and instead had been with another woman. Confronting him produced the same rehearsed performance: outrage, blame, gaslighting. "You shouldn't mistrust me," he said calmly. "Your imagination is dangerous." The family rallied in predictable ways. His mother offered gentle rebukes and reminded her of the virtue of silence. Friends became messengers of peace who suggested therapy and patience as if she were the one out of balance, and the businessman's allies circled to protect an image that, once polished, could deflect most accusations. But the evidence in her hidden folder grew heavier and heavier, and she realized the stakes were not merely marital but legal and reputational. If Togue's deals involved illicit practices, then being silent would make her complicit, and speaking could be dangerous not only to him but to her life. She reached out quietly to one person she had met at a fundraiser, the observant journalist who had once watched Togue correct her at a dinner, and their meeting in a crowded cafe was a kind of quiet conspiratorial exchange that makes plans into actions. She showed him documents, explained incidents, offered the journal pages that tracked dates, times, and phrases. And the journalist's eyes grew wide as he skimmed. He promised discretion, and the slow machinery of investigation began to turn. Meanwhile, Togue intensified his efforts to control the narrative. Publicly, he was a perfect husband. In private, he was a man who believed ownership trumped partnership. Yet with every attempt to break her, she grew more meticulous about preserving proof. Copies of bank statements, recordings of threatening phone calls, and a lawyer's name scribbled in the back of a journal just in case. The house that once felt like shelter had become a stage, and she learned to perform her assigned role in public and to collect evidence in secret, wearing a smile that disguised a mind working toward exposure. Fear remained a constant companion. He had power, contacts, wealth, and a pride that fed vindictiveness, but she felt the fear shift, from terror of being exposed to a burning resolve that the truth must be told, because the silence he demanded was not protecting family honor but hiding wrong, and her voice would not stay smothered forever. She rehearsed how to speak carefully, how to present facts plainly, how to turn personal pain into public accountability, and in those rehearsals Adana began to reassert herself, cleverer and more cautious, building a case not out of spite but out of a desire for justice. The breaking point arrived in a way that made every small wound suddenly visible. It began with a public event where Togue misread her loyalty and publicly humiliated her in front of his family and colleagues, accusing her of being disrespectful and making trouble for his household because she had modestly questioned a new financial decision he announced at dinner. And his voice cut through the room with the sharpness of someone wielding power to shame rather than to reason. She left that event, with her chest burning and the taste of humiliation metallic in her mouth. And that night she packed a bag of essentials more to soothe herself than to leave. But when he returned to berate her further, he found a woman who had already crossed an invisible line. She no longer apologized reflexively. She no longer swallowed each criticism into silence. Instead, she presented him with evidence, copies of documents, spreadsheets, and the journal entries that recorded dates and versions of events. And when he tried to bully her into silence with threats about reputation, custody, and ruin, she handed a sealed envelope to the observant journalist she had contacted, asking him to hold it unless Tobe escalated. The journalist, trained in the rhythms of scandal and careful with sources, began to corroborate her claims quietly, checking facts, confirming transfers, and preparing a narrative that could stand up to a powerful man's denials. The first article that mentioned the whispers about Tobe's business improprieties ran as a quiet thread on a Sunday morning, and then, like a match tossed into dry tinder, it caught. Social media amplified personal testimonies from women who recognized the pattern of control. Hashtags trended, and the world began to ask questions publicly that had only been whispered privately. Tobe reacted predictably: denials, charm, frantic damage control, threats. Yet every attempt to smear her backfired because she had documented everything. Her notebooks had dates, emails, receipts, and witnesses, and when she testified to what had happened, courts and public opinion could no longer treat her as merely emotional or vindictive. Friends returned to her side once the truth had traction, and women she had never met sent messages of solidarity and offers to testify about similar experiences. The narrative shifted from a private marital problem to a systemic pattern of abuse and corruption that demanded accountability. The fallout was immense. Partners pulled out of Tobe's deals, regulatory eyes turned toward his enterprises, and his family faced the unpleasant reality that their son's reputation could not simply be polished away. Adana, who had once feared that speaking would ruin everything, found that speaking liberated others and spared future victims. She stood in interviews with a steady voice in a journal that no longer needed secrecy because its contents were truth, and though the path forward remained painful with lawsuits and betrayals to weather, the moment she decided to make the world hear was the moment she reclaimed herself, turning a life of quiet suffering into a cause that would not only free her but ignite a conversation about voice, power, and the cost of enforced silence. The unraveling of Tobe's perfect facade began on an evening designed to elevate his public image, a lavish corporate dinner filled with wealthy investors, politicians, celebrities, and media figures ready to praise his every move. Adana wore a gold dress he chose, one that made her look elegant but silent, and she stayed close to him the way he preferred, speaking only when spoken to, smiling exactly as rehearsed. But everything shifted when a guest at their table asked her what her thoughts were on the rising corruption scandals affecting major companies in the city. She spoke carefully, offering a thoughtful opinion that impressed the table, yet Tobe's jaw tightened at the sound of her voice, and under the table his fingers pinched her thigh hard enough to make her gasp. He whispered, "Stop talking." But it was too late. The stranger across the table, a man with sharp eyes and a journalist's instinct, noticed everything: the pinch, the forced smile, the fear flickering in her gaze, and though he said nothing at the time, his expression shifted in a way that suggested he understood more than anyone in the room. Throughout the night, Tobe hovered like a storm approaching, and when they got home he erupted, accusing her of undermining him, of seeking attention, of making him look incompetent in front of powerful men. She stood silently at first, letting the storm pass, but inside a new anger rose slowly and steadily, not the fire of rebellion but the quiet flame of someone who had reached her limit. The next morning she woke early, body stiff from the stress, and in the kitchen she found a small bruise on her thigh from where he had pinched her. She stared at it for several minutes, then took a picture and saved it in her hidden folder of evidence. Later that afternoon she saw the journalist again, this time at a charity event, and when their eyes met he approached her gently, asking if she was all right, offering a business card with a subtle warning in his voice: "If you ever need to talk, I'm available." She tucked the card into her purse, heart racing, knowing she shouldn't keep it but unable to throw it away. That night she asked Tobe about some documents she had seen in his office, and his reaction confirmed her fears. He lashed out with accusations, claiming she was trying to spy on him, insisting she respect boundaries, twisting her worry into betrayal, and the argument ended with him storming out of the house and slamming the door so loudly the windows shook. She spent the evening alone, trembling, exhausted, and uncertain of her own reality, but as she picked up a journal to write she remembered the journalist's steady gaze. She wrote 4 words that felt like the beginning of her rebirth: "I am not crazy." She repeated it over and over, letting the truth settle back into her bones. The next morning she saw a strange car parked near their gate and a man inside who avoided eye contact. She reported it to Tobe, hoping for assurance, but he dismissed her concerns, saying she was imagining things, saying she worried too much. But she knew what she saw. She also knew what she felt. Something in her life was cracking open, and though she feared what might spill out, she knew she could no longer endure the silence he demanded from her. She began listening more carefully, watching more closely, and waiting for the moment when truth would no longer be a whisper in her journal but a voice the world could not ignore. The first major discovery that shattered the illusion entirely came on a quiet Wednesday afternoon when Tobe left his laptop open on the dining table, an unusual mistake for a man so careful with secrets, and Adana, driven by weeks of suspicion and an ache for clarity, approached it with trembling hands, scrolling through folders until she found a set of documents labeled innocently but containing evidence of illegal transactions, offshore accounts, and unreported funds that tied Tobe to a network of corrupt businessmen. She felt her breath catch as she clicked file after file, realizing the magnitude of what she had stumbled upon, understanding now why he needed a silent wife, why he needed someone who wouldn't question, wouldn't pry, wouldn't speak. She took photos quickly, saving them into her hidden folder, her heartbeat thundering in her ears as if warning her to run before she was caught, and just when she closed the laptop she heard the sound of keys turning at the door. She shoved the device back into place and rushed to the kitchen, pretending to pour water as he entered, his mood sour and his eyes scanning the room like a predator. He walked past her without a word, but she felt him studying her, sensing something was off. That night he checked his laptop carefully, and though he found nothing missing, his instinct screamed that she had seen more than she was supposed to see. He began asking strange questions. Did you go into my office today? Were you at home all afternoon? Did anyone call you? And though she answered calmly, the tension in the air thickened until it felt suffocating. She tried sleeping but couldn't. Every creak of the house made her flinch, and every shadow reminded her of the truth she now held, a truth heavy enough to destroy him but dangerous enough to destroy her as she revealed it without a plan. The next morning Tobe left unusually early, and while he was gone she made copies of the laptop files, backing them up in 2 different hidden locations. She didn't trust the cloud. It could be hacked. So she bought a small flash drive and stored it inside the lining of a purse she never used. Later that day, the journalist from the dinner event sent a casual message asking if she was all right. She ignored it at first, but when Tobe returned home acting unusually polite, flowers in hand, compliments flowing too easily, she understood he was managing her, not loving her. The performance was too smooth, too calculated, the apology too neat. She responded to the journalist's message with a simple, "Can we talk?" They met in a small park far from the city center, and she handed him the flash drive with shaking fingers. He listened without interrupting as she told him everything: the control, the silencing, the hidden drawer, the laptop documents. And when she finished, he said, "You're not safe if this is true. These men protect themselves." She felt her stomach twist with fear, but hearing the truth from another person validated what she had been trying to deny for months. As the journalist left with a flash drive, promising to handle everything with caution, she felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. She had taken the first step toward exposing the truth, but she had also crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. When she returned home, Tobe watched her with eyes that searched her soul, and she realized then that he felt the shift between them. He sensed the rebellion rising. He just didn't yet know how far she was willing to go. The fragile peace in their home shattered completely on a night when Adana decided she could no longer pretend ignorance. She confronted Tobe about the financial inconsistencies she had noticed, starting gently, as if giving him a chance to tell the truth. But the moment she mentioned the offshore accounts, his entire demeanor changed, his voice dropping into a cold growl as he accused her of being ungrateful, disloyal, meddlesome. And she saw with painful clarity that the man she married had never wanted a partner. He wanted obedience. He paced the living room like a restless predator, hands shaking with rage disguised as righteousness, lecturing her about boundaries she had crossed, claiming she had no right to question him, no right to know about business matters that didn't concern her. And when she dared to say, "But I am your wife," he laughed cruelly and replied, "You're my wife because I chose you, not because you get to question me." The words hit her harder than any physical blow, and in that moment something inside her snapped, not broken in defeat but snapped free, like a rope loosening from a stake. She realized she would never be allowed to understand his world because his power depended on her ignorance. Her silence wasn't tradition, it was strategy. He approached her slowly, menace in every step, and whispered, "If you speak about anything you think you've seen, I will ruin you." She stood frozen, heart pounding, but made no promise, no apology. She simply stared back, and that quiet resistance enraged him more than any argument could have. The rest of the night he alternated between threats and manipulative pleas, trying to scare her into submission. "Do you know what people will think of you? Do you want to destroy our family's name? Do you want my enemies to use you against me?" She said nothing. She simply let the truth settle deeper into her spirit. This marriage was a gilded cage. The next morning she pretended calm, cooked his breakfast, performed the routine he expected, but her silence was different now. It wasn't surrender but calculation. She retrieved the second copy of the file she had hidden, and added new recordings of their conversation. Meanwhile, the journalist texted her saying the investigation had already revealed names she didn't recognize, politicians, rival CEOs, fraudulent investors, and urged her to stay cautious. For the first time she understood that the truth she held had weight beyond their marriage. She was tangled in a web much larger than betrayal. That evening Tobe returned home unusually late, smelling of expensive whiskey and ego, and when she tried to greet him he shoved past her without a word, retreating to his office where he made frantic calls she overheard. Someone leaked something, find out who, no mistakes. Her blood ran cold. She realized someone in his circle had already sensed the investigation leaking through the cracks. She had started something irreversible. As she lay awake in bed, she whispered into the darkness, "I am not afraid of the truth anymore." And the words felt powerful, not like a confession or a plea, but like a vow. The atmosphere in the house grew tense enough to bruise. Every room filled with suspicion as Tobe monitored her movements with an intensity that bordered on paranoia. He checked her phone when he thought she wasn't looking, questioned her about every errand, scrutinized who she spoke to and where she went. And though she played the obedient wife on the surface, pretending nothing had changed, inwardly she built her escape plan piece by piece, documenting everything in her journal, every threat, every lie, every warning that confirmed her husband was not just controlling but dangerous. That week she caught him in an undeniable lie. He claimed he were traveling for a meeting in Abuja, but she saw a tagged photo online showing him at a Lagos lounge with another woman, laughing in a way she hadn't seen him laugh in months. She confronted him gently when he returned, asking simply, "How was Abuja?" And his reaction exposed more truth than any document ever could. He froze, stuttered briefly, then exploded with accusations, yelling that she was spying on him, that she was unstable, that she was imagining things, that she was trying to provoke him, turning his guilt into a weapon meant to silence her. But this time she didn't shrink. She watched him with calm, steady eyes, the way a witness watches someone who doesn't know the truth has already been recorded. That night she wrote a detailed account of the confrontation, adding timestamps, online screenshots, even noting the perfume she smelled on his jacket that did not belong to her. She was no longer documenting pain. She was building a case. Days later she overheard him speaking harshly on the phone, mentioning her name in a tone that twisted her stomach. "She's asking too many questions. I need to secure things. She cannot find out." The fear that gripped her was immediate and suffocating, but she used it as fuel rather than letting it paralyze her. She had backup copies of her evidence in 3 different locations, one in her car's spare tire compartment, another in a friend's mailbox, and a third entrusted to the journalist who was now fully invested in exposing the network behind Toad's businesses. As the investigation progressed quietly, the journalists uncovered that Tobe had been laundering money through shell companies and funneling payments to officials to secure contracts. Adana felt sick to her stomach when she learned the scale of the crimes. This wasn't just a selfish husband. He was a man whose empire was built on corruption, and her silence had been part of the camouflage. One night she went into the guest room, locked the door, and recorded a video diary in which she explained everything she knew, every detail she remembered, saying, "If anything happens to me, this is my testimony," and stored the video in her hidden folder. The next morning she noticed a new deadbolt installed on Tobe's office door and understood he was now guarding his secrets more fiercely than ever. However, he had no idea the most dangerous thing in the house was no longer the documents he hid, but the woman he underestimated. The moment Adana found the secret will, everything she thought she understood about her marriage collapsed like glass hitting concrete. She had been searching for her passport in the bedroom closet when she noticed a strange envelope tucked behind a stack of documents, and curiosity led her to open it, revealing a legal amendment that removed her name entirely from inheritance, property rights, and beneficiary designations, a complete erasure of her from Tobe's future. Her hands trembled as she read line after line, realizing this was not a marriage built on partnership, but a trap designed to secure his empire while leaving her with nothing if she ever dared to walk away. The betrayal felt colder than every insult and sharper than every threat. He had planned not just to silence her, but to discard her. When he came home that evening, she confronted him, holding the envelope with shaking fingers, and he smirked as if she were overreacting, saying, "It's just paperwork. You don't need to understand these things." But she could see in his eyes that he meant it, that he had rewritten her future without her knowledge or consent. She asked quietly, "So I mean nothing to you?" And he replied with chilling calm, "You are important as long as you play your role." The sentence stripped the last veil from her eyes. She no longer felt confusion or doubt. She felt clarity, pure and burning, and clarity birthed strategy. She spent the next days gathering everything she needed: her journal, copies of the secret will, voice recordings of Tobe's threats, screenshots of financial documents, and testimony from people who had seen his temper. Meanwhile, the journalist revealed that investigations had officially begun behind the scenes. Regulators had been anonymously tipped off, likely by someone in the network trying to protect themselves, and Tobe's associates were scrambling to cover tracks. Tobe, sensing danger, intensified his control, insisting on driving her everywhere, monitoring her calls, even attempting to persuade her to sign confidentiality documents disguised as family agreements. She refused politely each time, pretending confusion to avoid conflict, while secretly taking pictures of every page he tried to force on her. She knew she would need overwhelming evidence. Men like Tobe did not fall easily, and powerful allies protected him. But she also knew the world would listen once the truth had weight behind it. One evening, when he left for a meeting, she followed him discreetly using a ride-hailing app registered under a different name. She watched him enter a building tied to one of the shell companies she had seen in the laptop files, watched him greet men whose faces appeared in the journalist reports, watched him exchange envelopes and firm handshakes that carried the scent of conspiracy, and she recorded everything from a distance, heart-pounding but steady. When she returned home, she knew she was nearing the most dangerous stage: exposure. She hid multiple copies of the video in backup drives, one of which she mailed to herself so it would have a government timestamp. She felt fear, of course, the kind that shakes the bones, but beneath it she felt something else: power. The power of a truth fully assembled, a truth ready to break open the world. The stranger who first noticed Adana's pain at that corporate dinner finally stepped fully into the story on a rainy Thursday evening when she met him behind a quiet bookstore, her hood pulled low and her heartbeat wild with the fear of being followed. His name was Depo, an investigative journalist known in certain circles for exposing wealthy corruption while staying invisible enough not to be targeted easily. And when she handed him the latest set of documents, bank transfers, hidden, agreements, the evidence of financial crimes far bigger than marital betrayal, he studied her trembling hands and said, "You are carrying a bomb, and when it explodes, there will be consequences for everyone standing too close." She swallowed the fear that threatened to close her throat and replied, "I just want the truth to come out." He nodded with the solemn respect of someone who understood the weight of truth better than most, and he told her gently but firmly that the network she was entangled with was bigger than her husband, that powerful officials, businessmen, and international partners were involved, and that the moment she chose to expose the truth, she would lose every luxury, every illusion, every shield that her last name provided. But she had already passed the point of return. The secret will had severed whatever loyalty she clung to, and she knew that silence would no longer protect her. It would only bury her alive. Depo explained that investigations had begun quietly, that anonymous leaks were already circulating among regulatory agencies, and that some people in Tobe's circle were panicking enough to make reckless mistakes. He warned her that once the story broke, Tobe might try to discredit her, intimidate her, or even use legal channels to silence her, but the most dangerous response might come from his associates, men who would not hesitate to destroy anyone threatening their empire. As she listened, rain soaking lightly through her sleeves, Adana felt fear coil along her spine, but beneath it rose a certainty stronger than fear. She had lived in silence long enough. She returned home to find Tobe pacing the living room like a trapped animal, phone in hand, jaw clenched tight as he barked orders into the line. And when he saw her, he studied her too carefully, as if trying to decide whether she had already betrayed him. She forced a soft smile, pretending exhaustion, pretending innocence, but he watched her with the suspicion of a man who no longer trusted even his own shadow. He hugged her suddenly, too tightly, whispering, "I don't want anything to happen to you." And the irony tightened her throat because the only danger she faced came from a man embracing her. That night she slept lightly, listening to the sounds of him moving around the house, opening drawers, closing cabinets, searching for something he couldn't name but knew was missing, his control. When he finally entered the bedroom and stood over her, watching her pretend to sleep, she kept her breathing steady, praying silently, knowing that this chapter of her life had shifted from emotional captivity to survival. The truth was now alive, moving beyond her hands into the world, and she could no longer stop the storm building on the horizon. The scandal began as whispers, tiny threads of suspicion woven through the city's business community, nameless leaks hinting at corruption involving offshore accounts, bribery, and illegal acquisitions. And though no names were mentioned at first, regulators started quietly pulling financial records, journalists began making calls, and powerful men started sweating under their tailored suits. Then one morning everything erupted when a well-respected business newspaper published a bombshell report, linking Tobe's company to a chain of shell corporations used for laundering money and evading taxes. And though the article did not yet expose the full truth, it was enough to ignite panic across the entire network. Tobe woke up furious, slamming his phone on the counter as he screamed at his partners, demanding to know who had talked, who had leaked, who had betrayed him. And when he turned to Adana with shaking hands, he said, "Someone is trying to destroy me," as if he were the victim of a conspiracy rather than the architect of one. She pretended shock, asking softly, "What does this mean?" And he began pacing the room frantically, explaining how this was all a misunderstanding, how his enemies wanted to ruin his reputation, how she must not speak to anyone, not answer calls, not trust outsiders. He kept repeating, "We must protect ourselves." But she heard the truth in his trembling voice. He was afraid of losing everything. That afternoon the journalist, Depo, called her using a secure line and explained that the investigation had only just begun, that they had traced millions of naira through accounts registered in Tobe's name or linked to his signature, and that more evidence would break soon. He told her not to be alone if possible, not to let Tobe isolate her, and she realized that her husband's sudden affection and attention were not from love but from panic. He sensed danger and was trying to keep her close enough to control. The tension escalated when Tobe's lawyer arrived at the house with a stack of documents he insisted she sign, claiming they were standard marital protections. But when she skimmed them, she found clauses that would silence her legally, prevent her from testifying against him, and transfer liability to unnamed third parties. She refused politely, saying she needed time to read, and the lawyer's eyes hardened as he warned her that refusing could create problems. Tobe tried to persuade her gently at first, then angrily, and when persuasion failed, he resorted to guilt. "I trusted you. I protected you. Why are you behaving like this?" But she didn't budge. That night the second article dropped, this one more detailed, naming two of Tobe's partners and linking them to fraudulent deals that led to massive inflation of contract costs for government projects. And though Tobe's name was still not mentioned directly, everyone could read between the lines. Calls poured in, accusations flew across boardrooms, alliances broke apart, and in the middle of the chaos Adana watched them unravel. The confident man who once paraded around like a king now looked pale, sweaty, frantic, and desperate to hold on to a crumbling empire. She should have felt vindicated, but instead she felt sorrow for the life she had tried to build, the home she wished had been real. Yet she also felt something else rise inside her, something fierce and unstoppable. The truth was finally breathing, and she would not let anyone suffocate it again. The confrontation she had been avoiding finally erupted one night when Tobe discovered messages on her phone from Depo. He barged into the living room with the device in his fist, his face twisted with rage so violent she stepped back instinctively. But he followed her, shouting accusations that shook the walls, demanding to know why she had been speaking to a journalist, why she had betrayed him, why she had chosen strangers over her own husband. And though his words came out like thunder, she felt unexpectedly calm, almost attached, because she knew this moment was inevitable and she knew she finally had nothing left to fear. She said, I spoke to him because you have been lying to me. And the sentence sliced the air so cleanly he froze mid-step. She continued, her voice steady, telling him she knew about the offshore accounts, the fraudulent deals, the secret will, and the lies about his business trips, and she watched his expression shift from anger to panic to cold calculation. You don't understand anything, he said through clenched teeth, trying to regain control, trying to make her doubt herself, but she repeated the facts one by one, and with each word his power cracked like thin glass. When he realized he could not intimidate her with denial, he switched tactics. He sneered, calling her ungrateful, calling her simple-minded, calling her emotional and unstable, and he tried rewriting history, saying he had only ever tried to protect her, to shield her from the ugliness of business, to make decisions for them both because she wasn't ready to handle the truth, but she saw the desperation under his manipulation. He tried reaching for her face, cupping her cheeks as if to gentle her back into silence, whispering, I love you, everything I've done is for us. But she stepped away and said, love is not control. Love is not fear. And he recoiled as if slapped. When he realized emotional manipulation would not work, he threatened her openly, ruin, disgrace, financial starvation, family embarrassment. And as he poured out threats like water from a broken dam, she watched him with eyes that finally saw him fully, a man so terrified of losing power that he would destroy anyone who witnessed his weakness. She said simply, you cannot silence me anymore, and the words shattered whatever illusion remained between them. He lunged toward her then, not to hit her but to grab the phone she had managed to pick up, but she sprinted toward the upstairs hallway, locking herself in the guest room just long enough to upload a backup file to an encrypted drive. She could hear him pounding on the door, threatening to break it down, but she whispered to herself, I'm not afraid, and prayed silently while the progress bar inched forward. When the upload completed, she texted Depot with a single word, ready. She left the room slowly, expecting Tobe to strike, but instead she found him slumped on the staircase, breathing heavily, staring at her with a mixture of hatred, disbelief, and fear. He said nothing as she walked past him, and she knew then that the war between truth and silence had finally begun. Once the confrontation broke open, Adana wasted no time preparing her exit, not just from the house but from the silence that had bound her for so long. She spent the next 2 days moving like a ghost through the house, playing the obedient wife while secretly organizing documents, copying recordings onto multiple drives, scanning papers she hadn't yet preserved, and gathering personal items quietly so that her departure would not alert Tobe before she was ready. She knew she had to escape before the story went public because once the news broke, Tobe or his partners might try to retaliate violently to silence her. She could feel the danger thickening around her like smoke. She contacted a lawyer recommended by the journalist, a sharp woman with a calm voice who listened to every detail and said, You need protection, and you need to act fast. The lawyer helped her set up a legal shield, prepared emergency documents, and arranged for her to have temporary safe housing if needed. Meanwhile, Tobe oscillated between extremes, one moment acting loving, cooking her meals, planning imaginary vacations, the next moment pacing through the house muttering threats, asking cryptic questions, calling associates urgently, and retreating to his office at hours to delete files, call lawyers, or yell at partners who were abandoning him. She realized he could sense something coming, but didn't yet understand the scale. One evening, after pretending to sleep, she crept into his office using a key she had duplicated weeks before and found him storing files into a hidden safe she hadn't known existed. She took pictures of everything inside before locking it again exactly as she found it. The next morning she slipped her journal and the backup drives into her handbag, rehearsing her escape plan silently as she stood in front of the mirror, steadying her breath and whispering, Today, I leave. But fate intervened before she could walk out. Tobe received a call that made him go pale, and he rushed to dress up hastily, saying he had to meet with some partners urgently. As soon as he left, Adana called a journalist and a lawyer, telling them it must happen today. She packed only one suitcase, the essentials, the proof, and a few sentimental items, leaving behind every luxury that had disguised her suffering. She placed the suitcase by the door and looked around the house one last time, feeling a mix of grief and relief so deep it made her knees weak. She wasn't just leaving a man. She was leaving the silence he built around her life. She stepped outside moments before a black SUV she didn't recognize slowed near the gate, and instinct screamed at her to move. She hurried into a waiting taxi arranged by Depot, who had stationed a safety team nearby. As the taxi drove away, she looked back once and saw the SUV idling ominously. She didn't know if it belonged to Toad's associates, but she didn't wait to find out. She checked into a safe apartment under a different name and sent the journalist a final piece of evidence, a video recording of Toad admitting he controlled her to protect himself. Within hours, the investigative team finalized a report, and the world was about to hear everything she had hidden for months. The moment Adana stepped out of her old life and into the quiet anonymity of the safe apartment, she felt both the weight of danger and the freedom of truth pressing against her chest like two opposing tides, and she sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed gripping her phone with shaking hands as the journalist told her, "The story drops at dawn." Knowing those words meant nothing would ever be the same. She barely slept, pacing the small space, listening to distant traffic and imagining every possible reaction. Toad's fury, his mother's denial, the public shock, the powerful men scrambling to save themselves. But nothing prepared her for the explosion that followed the publication. At exactly 6:13 a.m., the investigative media outlet released a full expose, a 32-page report detailing Toad's financial crimes, laundering networks, falsified contracts, offshore accounts, and the names of the politicians and businessmen involved. And woven into the report was the story of a silenced wife, her story, told with dignity and accuracy, her journal entries quoted directly, her voice finally echoing across a world that had once praised her silence. Social media detonated instantly. Hashtags trended worldwide within an hour. Women shared their own survival stories. Men debated loudly online. Whistleblowers came forward from companies linked to Toad, and within the first 3 hours regulators arrived at his office, seizing computers and freezing accounts. Toad called her endlessly, first pleading with her to come home, then demanding she retract the story, then threatening lawsuits, then begging again, and she turned off her phone, not out of fear but out of self-preservation. Meanwhile, Depo and the legal team worked to secure protective orders for her, preparing for the legal storm that would now unfold publicly. Back at the mansion, Toad's carefully curated world cracked open. His mother fainted when reporters surrounded the gate. Shareholders resigned in disgrace. Employees fled. And the board announced an emergency meeting to consider removing him as CEO. When he finally appeared on camera that afternoon, trying to spin the narrative, he looked nothing like the confident man she once married. He looked smaller, angrier, unhinged, desperately trying to keep the lies afloat. But the evidence was irrefutable. Bank records, recorded calls, witness testimony, and the detailed journal of the wife he tried to silence. Adana watched the press conference from her safe apartment with tears sliding down her cheeks, not from pity or joy but from the overwhelming realization that she had survived something that had nearly consumed her whole identity. She had walked out with nothing but truth, and somehow truth was enough. Later that night, she recorded a video message to be released if necessary, saying, "For every woman who has been silenced, this is for you." And she understood fully for the first time that her story was no longer just haze. It belonged to every voice that had ever been pushed into quiet suffering. And as the world buzzed with her name and the truth she unleashed, she whispered to herself, "This is only the beginning." The world didn't just hear Dana's voice. It amplified it beyond anything she imagined. And the moment she stepped into the safe house living room that morning and saw her face trending across every major social platform, her stomach flipped with a mix of terror and liberation because she had never intended to become a symbol. She only wanted the truth to breathe. Yet now millions of people were reposting her words, quoting her journal entries, turning her whispered pain into global conversation. Journalists camped outside regulatory offices. Analysts dissected every line of the expose. Talk shows debated her courage, and women everywhere held her story like a mirror, recognizing their own silenced histories inside her testimony. Meanwhile, Toad descended into chaos, publicly denying the allegations while privately unraveling, making frantic calls to allies who were suddenly unavailable, issuing statements that sounded increasingly desperate, and showing up at his office only to find investigators sealing rooms and hauling boxes of evidence. Through hidden channels, Adana learned he had tried to file an injunction to block the story, but the courts denied it due to overwhelming proof, and he had tried to spin the narrative, claiming she was emotionally unstable, but his own recorded threats, leaked anonymously, destroyed that strategy instantly. The safe apartment became her cocoon. Depo and the legal team visited regularly, briefing her on the rapidly expanding investigation, explaining that international agencies were now involved because some accounts traced beyond Nigeria, and hearing that widened the scope of everything she thought she understood. Her husband wasn't just corrupt. He was a node in a global web of fraud and illicit finance. One night she sat on the couch watching a primetime documentary replaying her story, her photos, the mansion she escaped, testimonies from former employees who now felt safe to speak, and she felt her throat tighten with a mix of sorrow for the life she lost and pride in the woman she became. She whispered, "Mama, I did not let them silence me," imagining her late mother watching from wherever strength comes from. But even as the world rallied around her, danger lingered like a shadow. Anonymous threats arrived through email. Suspicious vehicles lingered outside the safe house, and the legal team insisted she remain indoors unless escorted. She felt fear but refused to let it root. She had come too far to retreat. When she finally agreed to give her first controlled interview, setting foot in a discreet studio with dim lighting and a calm female host, her voice trembled only at the beginning. Once she began speaking, she found clarity in every sentence, and by the end the host was in tears and the cameraman had stopped pretending not to be moved. Adana ended the interview with words that would echo across continents. Silence does not protect women. It protects the men who harm them. The clip went viral within minutes. Celebrities retweeted it. Activists quoted it in speeches. International organizations reached out to her legal team. And somewhere in the sprawling city, Tobe watched the video alone, his empire in ruins and the wife he tried to silence becoming a global voice. The internet exploded in a storm of commentary and support so massive that Adana could barely process the scale. Hashtags bearing her name trended for days. Artists created digital portraits of her. Survivors of domestic and emotional abuse began sharing their own stories under the movement her courage sparked. And thousands of women wrote messages saying, "You gave me the strength to leave," while news anchors framed her as a silent wife who roared. A title that felt surreal but not. Inaccurate. Public sympathy soared overwhelmingly in her favor, but with it came waves of backlash from those who felt threatened by a woman exposing powerful men. Some accused her of lying for attention. Some called her ungrateful. Others claimed she was part of a political agenda. And though their voices were loud, they were vastly outnumbered by supporters who recognized in her story the blueprint of countless hidden sufferings. Meanwhile, the investigation into Tobe's criminal network intensified as agencies raided offices, subpoenaed documents, froze accounts, and arrested several associates who immediately began turning on one another to reduce their sentences. The more truth emerged, the more monstrous the empire appeared. Fraud that spanned 3 countries, embezzlement schemes linked to government contracts, bribery rings that implicated officials who once toasted champagne with Tobe. Adana watched from the safety of her apartment, experiencing the bizarre duality of being both central to the storm and physically removed from it. At times she felt powerless watching events unfold on screens, but then she would remember the files she had provided, the journal entries she had written, the recordings she had kept, and she would realize that every line she had written in secret was now reshaping national discourse. At the same time, the journalist depot worked tirelessly, releasing follow-up articles, interviewing whistleblowers, and coordinating with a legal team to ensure she stayed safe. His calm presence became a rare comfort, someone who believed her long before the world did. During one meeting, he told her softly, "You changed the country," and she shook her head, responding, "No, I just told the truth." But he insisted, "Most people never dare." While the world debated her, Tobe's life spiraled downward rapidly. His business partners abandoned him. His assets were seized, his political allies withdrew their support, and his family hid from reporters while quietly pressuring him to settle with Adana or retract his accusations. But he refused, blinded by pride and fear. He released a shaky video statement blaming her for his downfall, calling her a traitor, but it backfired spectacularly. Viewers mocked him, analysts dissected his lies, and survivors online tore apart his manipulative rhetoric with fierce clarity. His public downfall grew more humiliating when leaked audio revealed him admitting to bribery, and suddenly the man who once prided himself on respect became a national disgrace. Adana watched it all with complex emotion, satisfaction that truth prevailed, sadness for what their luck could have been, and relief that she had escaped before his collapse dragged her under. Tobe's empire collapsed in a matter of days, not weeks, as if the truth had merely been waiting for a crack in the armor to burst through. Regulators seized properties. Banks froze accounts. Auditors swarmed every department of his company. Board members resigned en masse. And by the end of the week, the once glorious firm he built was suspended pending criminal prosecution. He was stripped of his CEO title after a unanimous vote and escorted out of the building he once dominated, cameras flashing mercilessly as he shoved through crowds of reporters shouting his name with acidic questions. The humiliation was total. Former supporters distanced themselves, business partners denied knowing the extent of his conduct, and political allies scrambled to protect themselves by sacrificing him publicly. Meanwhile, investigators interrogated him for hours, digging into his connections, and the more they unearthed, the clearer it became that Tobe was not just corrupt but reckless, leaving digital trails and signatures that pointed directly to him. As all this unfolded, Adana remained hidden but aware of every development. Her lawyer updated her daily, explaining that the case had grown so large that federal agencies were now preparing charges, and Depo told her that whistleblowers had begun coming forward voluntarily because seeing her courage made them believe they wouldn't be alone. Each update felt surreal. It was a downfall of a man she once loved, a man she once promised to build a life with, yet she could not deny that justice felt necessary, almost sacred. Still, she grieved for the version of him she once believed in, the imagined future she once held tight, the home she once decorated with hope. She grieved not for the man he truly was, but for the girl she had been, trusting, hopeful, willing to bend herself into silence to preserve a dream. But the grief did not weaken her. It sharpened her resolve. She understood that accountability required loss, both of illusions and of unhealthy attachments. When the official arrest warrant was issued and Tobe was taken into custody, cameras captured him looking disheveled and exhausted, shouting angrily at officers as if unable to comprehend how far he had fallen, and Adana watched the footage with steady eyes. She did not rejoice, but she did not look away. She knew this was necessary. In the days that followed, she received messages from women across the world, messages thanking her for speaking, messages sharing their stories, messages calling her brave, messages calling her a sister in struggle, and she responded to as many as she could, creating a small community of survivors connected by truth. Meanwhile, Tobe's family sent her frantic messages begging her to retract the allegations to save the family legacy, but she never responded. She had no legacy with them left to save. The truth had already done what it came to do: shatter silence, demand accountability, and force a man who thrived on manipulation to face the consequences of his own actions. And in the midst of the chaos, Adana realized she was finally breathing, deeply and freely, without fear of correction, without fear of judgment, without fear of raising her voice. The courtroom showdown became the final battlefield where truth and arrogance collided, a place where Adana would stand eye to eye with a man who had silenced her for years and speak the truth openly for the world to hear. The day began with heavy clouds outside and heavy hearts inside the building. And as she entered with her lawyer and security team, reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, microphones pointed in her direction, but she kept her gaze forward, refusing to let the noise penetrate her resolve. Inside the courtroom, Tobe sat at the defendant's table, his suit wrinkled, his face gaunt, his arrogance dim but not extinguished. He looked at her with a mixture of hatred and disbelief, as if still unable to accept that the quiet wife he once controlled had dismantled his entire empire. Proceedings began with prosecutors outlining the charges: money laundering, fraud, bribery, falsification of documents, tax evasion, and with each accusation Tobe's posture sank deeper. Then came the moment Adana dreaded yet anticipated. She was called to the stand. As she walked to the witness box, the courtroom fell into a hush, every eye fixed on her, every camera lens centered on her face, and when she took the oath her hand shook slightly but her voice did not. She began calmly, describing the early days of the marriage, the subtle control, the silencing, the manipulation, and she explained how those behaviors were not merely emotional abuse but tools used to isolate her from discovering the truth about his business dealings. She detailed the documents she found, where, when, how, describing each one with precision, her memory sharpened by months of journaling. The defense tried to interrupt, object, confuse, twist her words, but she remained steady, answering each question with clarity and confidence. When they accused her of fabricating evidence, she revealed timestamps, metadata, backup transfers, voice recordings, and screenshots that aligned perfectly with the prosecution's findings. When they accused her of seeking revenge after marital conflict, she read excerpts from her journal documenting the timeline long before she ever spoke to a journalist. The courtroom listened breathlessly. Even the judge leaned forward as she recounted the night she found the secret will, and realized her husband planned to erase her completely. Her voice trembled only once, when she said, "Silence was killing me, and truth saved me." After hours of testimony, she stepped down, and the room exhaled collectively as if witnessing something bigger than the trial itself. The prosecution continued with bank analysts, whistleblowers, and Depo, who testified about the integrity of the evidence she provided. Tobe refused to take the stand, choosing instead to sit rigidly, jaw clenched, eyes burning with a pride that had nowhere left to go. When closing arguments ended, the judge remanded him into custody pending sentencing, and as officers led him away, he turned to her one last time, his voice low and bitter. "You destroyed me." She replied in her mind, though not out loud, "No, you destroyed yourself." The courtroom doors opened, and reporters surged, but as Adana stepped outside into the storm of microphones and flashing lights, she felt like for the first time in years, because she had spoken, and the world had listened, life after the truth felt like stepping into sunlight after years in a dark room. The brightness was overwhelming at first, almost painful, but slowly her eyes adjusted and she began to see her new world clearly. A world built not on silence or fear, but on honesty, self, worth, and purpose. In the months following the trial, Adana became a national symbol of courage, invited to speak at women's conferences, interviewed by global news networks, and celebrated by advocacy groups who recognized the importance of her story in dismantling long-standing cultures of silence. She wrote a best-selling memoir titled The Voice They Tried to Bury, a raw and powerful account of her journey. And during book tours, women lined up for hours just to touch her hand and say, "You saved my life," or "You gave me strength," or "I am finally leaving." She did not take their words lightly. Each story she heard became fuel for the work she wanted to do next. With her legal team and several NGOs, she helped launch the Speak Without Fear initiative, a foundation offering legal, emotional, and financial support to women trapped in abusive or silencing relationships. Donors from around the world supported the cause, and soon safe houses were established in multiple cities, offering protection and empowerment to those escaping situations similar to Hayes. Adana visited these safe houses often, sitting with survivors, listening to their stories, assuring them that healing was possible. She found peace in helping others find their voices. Meanwhile, Tobe received a lengthy prison sentence after being convicted on multiple counts, and though his lawyers appealed repeatedly, the evidence was overwhelming and the courts upheld the verdict. His empire was dismantled, his properties repossessed, and his name became synonymous with greed and downfall. People sometimes asked Adana if she felt vindicated seeing him punished, and she always answered honestly, "Justice was necessary, but I don't celebrate his pain. I celebrate freedom from him, from silence, from fear." As the years passed, she rebuilt her life with intention, surrounding herself with supportive friends, reconnecting with family members she had distanced during her marriage, and allowing herself to rediscover joy in small routines, in morning walks, in laughter with people who didn't try to shrink her. She even began writing a second book, exploring not the trauma but the healing, the rebirth, the rediscovery of self. And one evening, as she stood on a stage in front of thousands at an international conference, the audience holding on to her every word, she ended her speech with a line that resonated like a heartbeat across the room. When a woman speaks her truth, the world shifts because truth is louder than fear. The applause was overwhelming. Not because she was famous, but because she was real, a living testament to what happens when silence breaks. As she walked off the stage, she felt an indescribable peace settle over her. She had not just survived, she had transformed. The woman who once whispered into a hidden journal had become a voice powerful enough to shake nations. And in her heart she knew her journey was far from over, but she would face whatever came next with the unshakable strength of someone who refused to be silent ever again.